And sometimes when you have these density independent factors, they can decrease the population to where it is below what is called the minimum viable population size. And the minimum viable population size is the absolute smallest population of a particular species that can continue to persist. The critical minimum threshold is basically below the minimum viable population size. And this is the population size below which the population will go extinct. So there is some leeway between these numbers, but they might be very close in some species and pretty far apart in others. But a minimum viable population size will lead to a slowly shrinking population where it just continues to get smaller and smaller and smaller. The critical minimum threshold is the population size where that population can never recover, even with help from humans usually. This is what's happening in these circumstances is a positive feedback loop. So this is the opposite of a negative feedback loop, which is maintaining a particular level. A positive feedback loop gets worse and worse and worse and worse and worse. So an example would be what's happening in the Arctic right now. As the temperature in the Arctic rises, the sea ice in the Arctic melts. And because there's less sea ice, the darker ocean absorbs more heat, causing the temperature to rise some more, which causes the ice to melt more, which creates more heat being trapped by the water, which causes a temperature rise. And then the ice melts more, etc. It's a bigger and bigger and bigger problem over time. And it just keeps going in one direction, whereas a negative feedback loop maintains one condition. We call this an Ali effect. This is where a small population, due to these positive reinforcement loops or positive feedback loops, they experience diminished survival and reproduction because they are small. And they get smaller, and then they experience more reduction in fitness. So some causes of Ali effects are the inability of individuals in small populations to find mates. Critical group behaviors become impossible because there aren't enough individuals to engage in those behaviors, and they can't communicate with each other because they need lots of individuals to be communicating everything at the same time. Some examples of these behaviors are defense phalanx in musk oxen. They are prey for wolves, but only the babies are vulnerable to wolves. And so the adults will form a circle with their horns out, protecting all the babies in the middle of the circle. But you have to have a certain number of individuals to make the circle. Otherwise, there's a gap, and the wolves just tear through the gap in the circle and attack the babies, and they lose. And so you would lose the babies, and then you have fewer individuals as adults in the next population, and then you're even more vulnerable and even more vulnerable over time. Penguins also engage in this sort of huddling behavior. If you don't have a certain number of penguins so that the individuals can be at the center of the huddle and stay warm, nobody stays warm, and you experience population decline because everyone is cold all the time. Razor-billed auks are a species of bird that will only breed if there are at least 7 breeding pairs in an area at the same time. If there are 6 breeding pairs or 12 individuals, nobody will mate, and therefore you experience zero fitness in a really small population. And when you have these Ali effects that just create positive feedback loops until you get smaller and smaller and smaller populations, we call that an extinction vortex. And the process of an extinction vortex is a low population size has low fitness, so survival and reproduction decline versus the average of a higher population. That low reproduction and survival makes the population smaller, and now the average fitness is even lower, so they survival and reproduction decline, etc. And you just sort of, they call it a vortex because you just circle the drain. You just spin and spin and spin in this positive reinforcement loop until the population goes completely extinct due to these Ali effects. So that is one of the reasons measuring population size is so important, because we have to be able to keep these populations or know when they're approaching these Ali effect population critical minimum thresholds so we can avoid them going through this extinction vortex from where we cannot recover them. In the next lecture topic, we'll talk about how we study populations, distribution in their environment.